Our speaker is Dr. Mitchell Gibbs, and who is a Fulbright postdoctoral scholar in collaboration with First Nations and the Coast Salish people, and has been researching Indigenous habitat restoration, which is community-led. So I'll hand the floor over to Mitch to give our acknowledgement to country, and then we'll be presenting, and afterwards there'll be the opportunity to answer some questions, and then we should be wrapping up just before 1 o'clock.
Cool.
Thank you.
Hello. Hello, so I say, by the name, I'm going to Gibbs. It's just saying, hello, my name is Mitchell Gibbs. Hello, my name is Mitchell Gibbs. I think for acknowledgement of the country, I think a lot of people hopefully know the difference between a welcome and acknowledgement. So for an acknowledgement, I think one of the nice things to really think about is what this place was used for before, all the buildings and everything like that. And I always get told by some of the elders about how the main area of the quad was like the running plains for the kangaroos, and they would be taken, hunted down into the, like a small valley into Victoria Park. And then there'd be like a little river there, but that's where they get cornered and killed. But know that like every place is a learning place. So those places, especially down that whole side there, would be where you would learn about the kangaroos and how they move and how they interact with their environment. And it's also about keeping that place in the form as well. So keep putting fire on it and making sure that that fire is keeping the habitat nice and healthy and allowing things to move freely through it. So as a way to, I guess, acknowledge the country that we're on is to understand it a bit more. So obviously pay respects to the people who have done that, all of the ancestors, all of the people who are still trying, and all the people who are trying in the future. So today I'm going to talk about the future of habitat restoration in Australia. Obviously this is a hopeful scenario. It's what I hope that occurs, but we obviously will see what happens. I did a Fulbright over in America, so this talk's really about understanding what a lot of the American, Canadian restoration projects are doing, and then how we can learn from that in Australia. So being able to find the way that the communities there have started these projects, and then bring that to our communities here. But I guess the first question you want to ask is, what is restoration? Like, are we wanting to go from what we were before all the way back? Because where we are now, we can't go all the way back. It's physically impossible. So when we start looking at restoration, we need to understand that we're not thinking about taking everything away, putting all of the like the sandstone that's in these walls back into the ocean. We're talking about bringing back the health of that environment and trying to get it back to what it used to be. And it's not, when I think about restoration, I'm not thinking about a perfect scenario where there's no buildings and no cars and there's no CO2 in the air. I'm thinking about incorporating Indigenous knowledge into that so we can start to understand a way that system works while enhancing it with modern technology. And so we've got to think about restoration as a way that moving forward, that we're working in conjunction with the environment and not just dumping stuff into there. And there's a lot of restoration projects that happen in Australia, and a lot of them really just dump stuff into the environment and then just wait for organisms to spawn or to collect on it. And it's not really treated that way when we look at it in an Indigenous context, in a First Nations context. Whenever we look at restoration, we're thinking about a garden that we have to maintain, we have to upkeep, we have to keep going back to these places. And these places are places where you start learning and start teaching and start having language and start understanding things in there. And so when we think about restoration, I think we need to take away the restorative practices that people are looking at, like health of the waterway, and start looking at it much more holistically. start looking at a restoration as restoration in a societal sense, restoration in a biodiversity sense instead of just the health of the environment. So again, like restoration isn't going all the way back to what we were before colonisation, but it's also not staying where we are now. So the first place I went to when I was in America was in the Swinomish nation in Washington of the US. So that was on a place called Kiket Island in the Kukatali Reserve. And down the bottom left, your left, yeah. Bottom left, you can see that's the clam garden that they've put in. Now, so most of the ones that I'll show today are much more restorative, but this one was actually one that they've put in. And this was designed by the elders in the community who said that there was 3 places that were kind of given to them by the community. And then the researchers who were working on it, who also are Swinomish, they chose that one in conjunction with the community because it's easier for the elders to get down to as well as the fact that it's right next to an old clam garden. So they weren't able to say that the old clam garden was an old one because then there's more restrictions around it. So they had to, their project only was to put in a clam garden as a demonstration. And so whilst they're working on that one, there's one, as I said, right next door that they're working on, but in secret, so don't say anything. But there's also limitations to that. So as you can see here, you've got eelgrass, and along that beach, eelgrass, because this is a very big salmon sort of area. Like when I was there was salmon jumping all over the place. And so eelgrass is where salmon really like to eat and like to go into. And so there's a lot of restrictions around eelgrass and anything that's been done where eelgrass is. And so they had to actually cut it short for where they wanted to go because there was an eel, like the ending of it is like here, then there's an eelgrass little plantation thing here, like it's right next door. And that was because if you start building that rock wall around it, it starts changing the amount of water that goes in and how it goes in. And so I should have also said, this is what they're after, the clam. Oh, I thought if I touched the screen, it was going to change. This is what they're after. They're after the butter clams. But in this place, and I should also say that another reason why they chose this place to go to was because, so that whole area was owned by the Swinomish, Salish, and another clan. They all had to be put together into the one reserve. And so when they did that, they had all of this land that they were able to have. And then the Washington government kind of talked in the community to say, well, you're not really doing anything with the land, so how about we break it up for you? And then you can start to really do something with it. You can start to, I don't know, put some cattle on there or whatever. And so some people started selling off bits of these, the reservation. And so that island got sold off to this heiress who was, I don't know, some lady who had a lot of money. And she didn't own the beach, but she owned the island itself. And so to allow people to get on there, they had to walk onto her property and then down onto the beach. And so this place then was a place that people weren't allowed to go to because her partner and her family wouldn't allow Indigenous people to go to this place anymore. And so, and it got so destructive that people were even like firing shots at other people for being on that land. And so a lot of Indigenous people were like, nah, look, that's a really bad place for us. We don't go there anymore. A lot of people have passed away because they've had to, the water comes in really quick. And so to be able to go back to those traditional places, they had to walk in the water around. And so when the water was coming in, it could wash people away, which people had been washed away. And so it became a really dangerous and a very sad place for a lot of people in that community. And so what ended up happening was that the family who owned that island, it's a bit of a sad story, but also, I don't know, you can judge for yourselves. The husband of the wife ended up, was shooting at people, didn't kill anyone there. They ended up breaking up. And so she moved down to somewhere else in America and she started dating her bodyguard. So then the guy who was living there with her went and killed the bodyguard. And then the parents didn't want anything to do with the property anymore. So they gave it back to the Washington state. And so Washington State was then going to sell it off for a reasonably cheap amount, but no one really wanted to buy it. And so after that, Washington and the Swinomish Nation then came together and said, well, we can own it together, we can manage it, and you can just, I don't know, put your fares and stuff there for, because you have to pay for parking and stuff there. And so that was the way that Swinomish ended up getting that area back. But because of that, and for that was for the last, I think, 20, 25 years. And then since then, even then, a lot of people weren't going to that place. So then all of a sudden they started bringing this restoration back and people started going back there. And we had an event when we were there, and there was a lot of elders that were crying when they went there because they hadn't been there for 60 years. And they were telling stories about when their parents used to throw them on their back and walk around the side of the beach and all these different things. And it meant a lot for the community to be back in that place. So that's the reason why I was there. The other thing is that when we start bringing restoration back to these places, we start bringing culture back to these places. So this isn't actually at that specific place, although I should have taken more photos, but this one's in an island in Canada, I forget the name of it. And so that's elders. There's a couple of elders back there, and this elder was back turned here. They're talking about stories that were happened in these places. They're telling us how they could identify clans or which clans they wanted to get, depending on the type of year, time of year. They're talking about why we're digging up the soil there. And so, as I said before, it's a garden. So what we were all doing was turfing up this soil to allow the oxygen and all the dead kind of soil to be washed away, and all the nice soil to be kind of reinvigorated by the water that comes in. And even that practice, so they were talking about how this is important for them. And sorry, it's Saturna Island. And so they were talking about how important that is for them, and they were saying that they're clan people. And so those clans mean a lot because it's obviously a big food source that they have, but it also brings back their trade routes that they used to have. So they have cousins up in Nanaimo, which is quite a far away, but they from there they would trade deer and antlers and hooves. So they use the hooves for like shakers and stuff. So they would trade like the shells and the clams themselves for these sorts of important cultural aspects. And so it really does bring back that trade and sovereignty that they had around their food, but also the importance of connection with other communities and other brothers or sisters in other areas. And also just talking language, talking stories. There's a lot of young people that are in the Canadian national parks, I guess you'd call it, and the reason why is because a lot of people that were in the Canadian parks were quite old, and they didn't have that, I guess, that openness and insight to look further into the future. And so the Canadian parks got rid of a lot of them and brought in a lot of young people. And so this guy here is actually the director of his area in Canadian parks. And he's only, I don't know, 3 or 4 years older than me. Like, I'm not saying that I'm young, but it's not that old. And there's a lot more foresight into where they want to go with Canadian parks than I would say what we've done here in Australia as well. So I also went to Alaska in a place called Kikwan, which is cake, is the English way of saying it. So this is a small island, and I'm pretty sure the island's called Kuprianov Island. Russian name. And it's on the handle, I guess you could call it, in Alaska. So you've got the saucepan up there, you've got the little handle. It's only just down there. So here they had a demonstration clan garden where they would show what clan gardens were and how they would work so that people can do it around the island. Now the island's quite big, but the elders can't get everywhere around the island. And as you can see, most people are living just here. Not many people are living on the other side of the island. The island has 550 people in it, so it's not a huge community. But they needed to do that. Throughout COVID, they didn't have enough food on their island for when the barges came through. They get there, and the barge had like either nothing or not much left on it. So they needed to be able to go back to traditional methods. And so in this place, they said, well, why don't we bring back clams? Why don't we, and they always did like bear hunting and deer and moose and all that sort of stuff. But they had a lot of those shellfish and all of the fishery practices kind of left out until the salmon season, obviously, but kind of left out. And so they started to bring back those because they started running out of food. And the demonstration clam garden that they had actually is down in this little area here. So just out front of what they call OVK, which is an organised village of cake. It's the organisation that kind of runs the town or the village. And with that, they were able to show what a clam garden looks like, how it starts to be restored, how they are to manage it and turn it over and try to get more seaweed and everything in. But they did that so the elders could be there. They could sit on pretty much a footpath and be able to talk to the people and yell at the people while they're working on it. And so when people would learn there, they would then go out to other areas of the island where they knew that there were these clam gardens and start restoring them. And so over this island, they've started to see more and more people are coming back to the OVK telling them that they've got these clam gardens and this is where they are, and they've started restoring them themselves. Cake's, I guess, interesting in the fact that they didn't worry about getting any sort of legalities around putting in anything or doing any sort of permits. They just went and did it. They're on a big island, but they're on an island. There's one police officer there, and 98% of the community is Indigenous. So they weren't really worried about saying, should we or shouldn't we do this? They were just like, yeah, we're doing it. But because of that, because they just didn't care about the legalities of it, they're able to get through COVID. Like they were able to use a lot of, or find a lot more food sources to be able to get through. And that's also given a lot of encouragement to other communities who are along from Washington all the way up into Alaska to do the same thing. There's Haida Gwaii, who's right just a bit south in Canada, and they're doing a very similar thing now. And then even just west of Cake, you've got Sitka, and they're doing the same thing as well. They're looking at how they can do clam gardens based on their traditional knowledge. And the thing that I found interesting there was that they were telling these stories about how important clams are, but then how much people didn't know about them. They kept talking about how clams were this amazing food source. We've always been treasuring, we have stories about them. But then when you start talking to people, they're like, I don't know the stories. I just know we have stories. And so a lot of these programs are bringing school kids down to these places along with elders so they can start sharing cross-generational. And one of the elders was talking about how the fact that they're Tlingit people. So they arrived on that island because there was a sun shining down onto it when they were canoeing past. There was a sun shining down onto it. And they went onto the island, they could see this river, and they could see deers, they could see clams, they could see sunshine, so they had fresh water, they had food, they had enough place to be able to set up camp. And so they say that that island asked them to be on there. And so all these parts are then not being recognised when we're not taking into account the practices around clams. And so they're really starting to bring those back so people can understand how important clams actually are for their community. This is where so this is looking outside the window of the office of the OVK, and this is where the clam garden is. It's obviously, there's too much water there. But so in clam gardens, they have a point. They have a point, an anchor stone, I think they call it, where you'll set up a rock wall to there, and then it'll come back. And interestingly, the way they move them around is they wait until the water goes out, they dig a hole underneath and put wood, and they let the water come in, and then it just lifts it up and they just push it around to wherever they want it. Because a lot of times with changing environments, you need to change the practice that's there. So like that rock wall would need to either move forward or back, depending on water sea level rise. And so the rock wall goes along the side. I should do it on the outside actually so they can see. So the rock wall comes along here and then goes back down here. I think it's that dark patch there. And And this is really just an image of some salmon jumping, but that's just where it is. And so you can see how close it is to the community. So everyone can get there. And as I said, that's just in the office. Just outside, there's a little table where they've set up for the elders to sit down when they are doing any work there and demonstrating for schools. Yep. All right, so I also went to Hawaii, and in Oahu, I was in a place called Waimanalo. So to start with, there's a lot of different ponds that they have there. So some of them are turtle ponds, some of them are fish ponds, some of them are oyster ponds. It just depends on what you're trying to restore. But for this one, this is a turtle pond, and it's not really for this one specifically, which I thought was interesting. It's not for like having turtles in there and breeding them and then letting them go. It's more when this area, the chief used to live right behind there, and so that was like a little place that they put the turtle for when he wanted to eat it. So he'd just come out, get the turtle, and then go back inside and cook it up. But it is interesting because it's now, obviously it has that background, but it's now used more as a like a fish pond to be able to bring fish into, and then obviously with all the clams and all the worms that are in the water there. And so it's much more of a diverse system now than what it was before. As I said, it was just a pen. But it's diversified from that, and people are wanting that story to keep going, but they also want to show how these places still are important, but it wasn't as important as it was then based on cultural value, but now it's more important because it's helping the environment. And then as part of, so Waimanalo, Lima, Ua is, so Lima is seaweed, and Ua just means like collective kind of thing. And so that's a non-for-profit. Now, a lot of these places in Hawaii especially, they have non-for-profits for their area. So you can have like a fish pond outside your house, and then you can then apply to become a non-for-profit, so you can put money into that. And Waimanalo is one of those. But in part of that non-for-profit, they obviously apply for funding. Those funding, they can get scholarships and grants. And what that does is that they then filter that into their community to then build up more. So this Ahana is the word for family. So the family of Fernandez, who are 5, which is the 5th collective, they're doing a program through this non-for-profit. And so that program was looking at using seaweed to be able to show how it's giving health to the community. And so what they're doing is the Waimanalo collective go to their house, they build these little aquaculture systems where they've got these boards up top with the pumping water, and then underneath all the poo and everything from the fish, then go down into where the seaweed is. And so they're eating the fish, they're eating the seaweed, and then they're working with different hospitals to then show, and all they're getting is a prick in the finger, but show how that's affecting their health. And so they've shown how much between the ages of, I think it was 13 to 18, hasn't really done too much. You know, kids, they're going to eat shit. Then you've got all of the old people from, I think it's 70 to how old people are getting. And not much has really changed between there. But the people in between, from the 18 to 70-year-olds, their health has gotten a lot better. And that's looked at the amount of sugars within their blood, as well as the amount of omega-3s that they're having in their system. And I think it's the cholesterol within their blood as well. And so they're able to show that even just these small systems that families are having, they're showing how good they are. And that's just off a small system that now everyone is starting to put into their homes. And so that's one program that they have. And this is another one here. Oops. This is another one here working with different plants. And so I think, yeah, this is Hua 6. And so they're working with different plants than what the Hua 5 will work with. And so they're showing all of these benefits to their traditional foods. They also have connections with universities where they're connected through, this one's the Centre for Indigenous Innovation and Health Equity. And so they're looking at showing all these inputs that are coming from community and community-led resources and practices into the university. So they're trying to write papers up about it and show the world how good things can be. And then there's also ones with the diabetes, so trying to take diabetes more, get rid of those sugars in your systems. And that's with a hospital that they have an equitable, I guess, program together where one of them talks about the impact it has on the community, which would be the Liwahua, and then the hospital then talks about the impacts it has on their health. And so it's they work together in that sense. One of the biggest places I went to for a fish pond, now that's the whole fish pond, just to give you and that's 60 hectares. So it's a reasonable size. That was made over 1,000 years ago, kind of crumbled down, and then has been built back since I think 1997. And as it says there, it's called Paipaihea. And it is massive, but even the walkway is incredibly well done. And there's a thing in there, which I'll show you in a sec. Actually, I can show you now. You've got these gaps that allow for the water to go through. And obviously, you can't just block the water off. You need it to go through because you also need the fish. And so that's what these are as well. They're little gates to allow small fish to go through. So then when the fresh water comes down off the mountains or out of the springs, mixed with the salty water, makes that really nice brackish water. The fish love to eat it. And so the small fish go through there, they get all nice, big and fat, and then they can't leave. And so that starts to make a system in there where you've got a lot of good food, but it doesn't stop. When they spawn their progeny in there, they can also leave. It doesn't have to stay there. And so you're not blocking it off, so you're really separating it. You're just limiting what the fish can do. And this is also called a makaha. So maka is eye and ha is like breath. So it's like the breath of the pond kind of thing. And this is, maybe I can just, no. This is, so I was standing on a jetty that's really far in on the fish pond, and you'll be able to see just how long it goes. So this is the path that actually goes around the fish pond, so it's decently wide. Like it'd be about from here to the wall. And there's the huts along the way. So there's, I think around the whole thing, there's about 4 or 5 huts. But you can see just how big it is. And that's the first hut there. Yeah. But there's one thing here that a lot of other places around the world seem to disagree with, and it's the mangroves. There, it's invasive, and it ruins a lot of the fish ponds because the mangroves get in there, all the dirt from the mangrove area gets stuck, and then it doesn't allow for those freshwater springs to connect to the salt water. And so it's creating a solid state where it wasn't traditional. And so there's people whose whole jobs are to get rid of mangroves. And obviously that's counterproductive compared to what other people believe, but for their communities, that's what is the best thing. And then outside that, there's people's whole jobs that are just to go into the mangrove, into the mud, and just clear a way for the freshwater spring to come back out. And that was traditionally someone's job, and it still is now. And one of the, not here, I went to a different one. We did that. We went in and, oh, it smelled good. There was also, so these huts, traditionally you have someone that sleeps in those overnight, and especially around the full moon periods, to when there was too much fish going in, so they would have to change the gates, or whether there wasn't enough fish going in, they had to change the gates. Yeah, so there people would sleep in those, and that was their job, to make sure that it was done properly. And if there's too much flow, there's too much flow going through, then they'll have to change the gates as well. Yeah. So, where does that bring us? At the moment, I've got a program or a project working with the Gamma Rangers, and we're working with the community. So the start of our project is really just sitting with community, seeing what they want to do, talking about what organisms do they want to restore, where do they want to restore it, and how do they want to restore it. And this is just an example, but they're some of the stuff they're really interested in: scallops, mussels, pippies, clams, oysters, lobsters. They want bimblers. They want all of these food sources, but what is the most productive way to move forward? And I've said to them as well, like, it's not very much money. It's not like we have all the time in the world, but we do have enough time to have an initial project started. We do have enough money to do one thing and initially start that, and then we can venture out and get some more funding. And but the whole point of it is it's starting with the community. And so a lot of the elders are coming back, talking about what these places meant to them, what they used to do with some of the resources that were there, whether it be the shells, whether it be the fish, whether it be anything else. And the language that is from there as well. We start talking about like the mullet runs and the stories and how that teaches their young, but that's not done through schools. That's not done even in the community as much because people are going to schools. So we want to again get experiments for the people from schools to then come into these places to learn from the elders. And so from my context, I guess the way I see myself anyway, is like an avenue for funding to go out to the community so we can have more community doing these projects. And as I said before, we need to treat these projects as a garden, not as a dump and run. One of the things that they really like to talk about is the mullet runs. And this is one that happened last year in March. So as if you can see the dark spot there, that's the mullet. And it will, they will go up and down the side of that water until they've had enough food, and then they dart out to the ocean. And you'll be able to see there's another group just here. Oh, that's the thing. This one's better. So you can see like there's a dark spot here, and there's that dark spot that was over there as well. And as I said, like they're in different groups, so you can kind of see how many. Once you know what you're looking at, you can kind of see how many are going to be in those groups. And so, like even when I was there, the community, some of the elders were like, "Oh, that's 50 boxes." They can do it by boxes because that's what they're chucking them into. But they know that that's 50 boxes, and so from that they know how many people in the community they can feed. And they still do that now, and they were doing it through COVID when a lot of people weren't able to leave their houses. And so we want to make sure that these practices are still being put into the environment and making sure that if we're to know about it, then everyone should know, because otherwise, if people start knowing about the mullet runs, then they don't care whether they're taking females or males or how old they are. And so we need to make sure that the knowledge is being shared as well as the practices. And I'll say, thank you for having me. Oh, and then some words that I learned whilst I was over there was Haichka, which means thank you in Hokkaido. So, Haichka.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. So I think we'll go over to some questions. So does anyone have a question? Archana?
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. These projects are very interesting, but I really know nothing about restoration. So maybe I just want to know something very basic. First thing, how do you really identify which projects are the best for a community to restore?
How do I identify?
How do like anyone identify?
I don't identify. I let the community identify, and that's based off where these resources were originally. So let's say with Gamma Rangers. And so to start, I'll go back. The stuff that they've done in America and Canada, they're restoring places that you can physically see built things there. So you can physically see the walls, you can physically see the fish ponds. They're just restoring those. Here it's a little different because there's a couple of places where we did build things like fish traps and stuff, but there's other places where we didn't, but we still had cultivation practices and natural built-up environments. And so for myself, I go to the community and ask them where these things used to be. So let's say if they're talking about oysters, I'd say we'd talk about stories about where the oysters used to be and be able to put that into context of why they were there, and then be able to understand, is that the place you want to put them now and why? And if there's many places they used to be, why do we have to pick that one when it's in a sanctuary zone? Let's pick one that is a place where people can go, can take things from, can be able to take students to, or kids to teach. Yeah.
One more question. So I guess this restoration project, each one has different impacts on like different aspects, social, ecological, environmental.
Yeah.
So how do you really measure those, or is there some optimum level where you say now the restoration is at its best, as you know, is doing the best for the community? Or something?
Yeah, so that'll come into the, I guess, the monitoring phase of that. Pardon me. And I think that we would take, I guess, a similar value to what they've done over in America. So there's papers from Anne Salomon, Melissa Poe, Marco Hatch, quite a few people that talk about the benefits that these clam gardens are given. They also talk about some of the negatives. Obviously, reshaping the beach does change the beach. But, and I should have also said that the way that those clam gardens work is that you have this rock wall that comes out, and clams can only live in like a 30-centimetre area in the tidal zone for where they are. And so if the beach is quite sloped, it's only a small area. But if you put a rock wall out at a certain height, it then changes the beach, so it levels it out a lot. And so that whole area where clams can be then expands. And so when you do that, it changes that environment, and they know that. But what it also does is that it limits the amount of impact from ocean acidification and climate change effects. It brings in more oxygenated water, but also allows more algae and plant growth there as well. And so this is much more of a shell hash sort of environment, and it's turned over a lot. Again, you want to be turning it over as well. It's one of those, it's a garden, you can't just leave it. Otherwise things do start to decline. And so if there's a huge amount of clams in that area, but they only turn over a certain amount, then it starts to then decline. And they also know that the biodiversity within those areas tenfold is better. They also know that the amount of physical specimens in that area is exponentially more. I didn't get the numbers, but I can probably flick you some papers if you want them. Then they're also, it's interesting when you just go there, you can see how on one side of the beach, there's like maybe a couple of spurts from where the clams are, but where the clam gardens are, it's just raining with how much is happening. It's like night and day, pretty much. You can see how healthy one side is and how unhealthy the other is. And the other side of that is that on the other side of the rock wall, you're creating a rocky reef. And so on that, you've got crabs, certain fish, depending on the habitat complexity that's there. You've got kelp. And these are all important organisms for the community, but also for the interaction between the two as well.
Question. Thank you for that presentation. What a great adventure. All those communities that you visited and their restoration projects, often based on food sources from the coast, what is the concern with sea level rise? Do they have?
Yeah, so especially with the clam gardens and obviously with the fish ponds, but not as much because fish ponds walls are out of the water a fair bit more. But even when I was there, even at Paypay, they were talking about how they're probably going to have to go up a couple of levels of rocks. But the clam gardens work because it stops the amount of water coming over the top, which would then, if it's higher, then that levelling out will be too low for the clams to be in. And so they would then have to build that rock wall higher and higher. But what generally happens is that once low tide comes in, they just move the rock wall up. So it's like maybe a longer process, but you can just tilt the rock wall to come back in, which is why I was saying with the big anchor points, they put the wood underneath them to then move it in a little bit and then go to that.
Great. So we've had a few questions come through on the Zoom, so I'll just read them out. So the first one's from Katie, who says, great presentation, Mitch. What does the continued engagement with these communities look like? And should love to know more about the ongoing community-led governance for these projects.
So the projects that I had overseas, I'm talking with the US consulate about getting a group of the people that I worked with over there, so team leads within elders from Washington, from Hawaii to then come here. And also looking at getting people from here to go over there. So getting all these people to learn from each other, make a collective of First Nations knowledges, and also the way that like restorative practices occur. And I should also say that Canada's, I guess, idea of legal side of things is much more similar to Australia's than what America's is. So I was talking to the Hulkaminam, the Ketchin, there's another group, Stedness, I think it's called. Anyway, I was talking to the different groups that were in Canada, and they're very keen on coming here as well. So we're trying to get a collaborative international sort of thing where we have like team leads with elders that come here, but we'll see how it goes. Oh, and then here I work with the Gamma Rangers, so I just go and talk to them.
So the next question is from Mika, who's interested to know about how young people are brought into these projects and their level of interest and what role they play within these projects.
Yeah, so for all of them, we generally try to get school groups involved. So in Alaska, in Cake, they have school groups go, but they also have a thing called cultural camps where they have community elders talk to them about cultural practices. And they say, look, like one of the cultural camps that they were talking about was that they had a bear that they killed. And so they taught all the kids how to skin the bear and then to take all the meat from it properly and all that sort of stuff. And so parts of the cultural camp goes for a week. You go camp out on the beach and you learn all that stuff. Parts of the cultural camp are specifically associated with the clam gardens now. Before they weren't, but now they're specifically associated with clam gardens so that they've got kids learning these practices and then taking them into their families and into the schools. In summertime, they also have ocean representatives, I think, from their schools. So they have two people that are, either get voted or get chosen or whatever. They go around and learn all these things so they can take it back to the schools as well. But they also have an actual role in monitoring it as well. So they're playing an active part in making sure that environment is being healthy. We'll go Swinomish. They do something similar where they get schools involved. Theirs is, because it's, I guess, a much more urbanised area, it's a lot less, it's not like they can do all the cultural practices that they can up in Alaska. So they don't have the cultural camps that they do in Alaska and in Swinomish, but they do have a lot of schools that go there. And one of the community elders teaches at one of the schools, so they're constantly getting people from that school there as well. And then obviously that goes back into the community. They've got a school in Lummi who does a bit of work as well. Lummi is the nation that's kind of just north of Swinomish. They've got their own school, and so they've got people in that school teaching about clam gardens. And so some of their researchers at the university who are, one lady is just starting her honours or masters or something. She goes back to the school and teaches in that as well. And then in Hawaii, they've got this similar sort of thing where they get schools down to actually physically do the work. With the repairing of the fish ponds, they've got all these little kids out there carrying rocks. And I should have said too that the way that you put rocks down is because in Hawaiian culture, they say that everything has a spirit, everything has a soul. And so if you throw the rock down onto the wall and it smashes against the next rock, it's like you're smashing two rocks together that now are going to hate each other, but have to live the rest of their life together. And so, and that will just make an unsturdy wall because they want to be apart. And so when you're placing the rocks, you have to know that it's touching at least 3 points and that you're placing it, not just smashing it down. Yeah, and then here we're looking to do the same, get school kids involved. Indigrowers connected with the Larkaroos primary school, and so Uncle Rob's nephew runs Indigrow. We're getting Indigrow and the school to then come over. I'm also connected with Go Foundation, so we want to get partnerships of their scholarship kids to then go there and then learn from those practices as well.
Great. So we've got time for a few more questions from the room. I'm not sure who was first, maybe Leanne?
Thanks, Mitch. Really interesting stuff. Fascinating presentation. Thanks. I've got, forgive a bit more of a sort of political economic question, digging into the social organisation side of things. Do any of the cases involve, you mentioned really quickly some of the different governance, different interactions with government regulation in Alaska versus Seattle or Washington. So do any of the cases involve conflicts or otherwise like relationships with like commercial fishers or other government actors or other sort of interested parties where there could be conflicts?
Well, ask one question at a time.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so especially in Swinomish, because it's a much bigger area, and so it's just outside Anacortes, which is like a big harbouring community. And so there's places that are kind of like blocked off for research. And so that research, because Marco Hatch, the guy who's running the clam garden restoration projects for Swinomish through the university, they put up signs, but a lot of people don't like to be told they can't go somewhere. So they go there, they check it out, but what they then do is they have people and they have signs and all these other things to be able to tell the community or talk to other signs to illustrate the impact that these are having on the area and the community that's there. There is obviously some sort of roughage between the two, whether it's the fishing community or not. But I think the fishing community largely on a whole does understand that the more that these places are being built up, the more there's food for the fish, which allows for more fish to be born, as well as more habitat for them as well. And so there's some people that don't like to be told they can't go somewhere, but then the vast majority, from what I understand, are accepting of it because it means more fish for them anyway in the long run. In that place. Worse in Hawaii because people like tourist places and that's kind of what Hawaii is seen as. And Alaska, they don't really give a shit. No one really goes there, so they're like, try it. Yeah. But it's interesting though in Canada because I guess the governance side of things, they're supposed to go for, so in Australia we have Indigenous fishing practices and fishing rights. So I can go out, I can fish. I've got my letter on me to say I'm Aboriginal. I don't need a fishing license. But what does that extend to? And so in Canada, they've been like, well, that extends to all fishing practices and all fishing cultivation. And so they do all of theirs without getting any of the permits to do it. And so for Ketchum, one of the places I was working with, they've got lawyers who are, and they've been pulled to court a few times and they always get off because they keep putting it under cultural fishing practices. Yeah. And that's community people from especially Vancouver Island and Victoria there. That's those communities that have been like, you shouldn't be doing this. And then they were like, call the police. And so they do. And then they're like, gives them the paper. They're like, oh, we can't do anything. Yeah.
Well, I think we've got time maybe for two more quick questions. So maybe you've been waiting for quite a while, and then Phil, I think you had your hand up.
Thanks. So just a couple of comments first and then a question. So first, I actually did my PhD on customary coral reef management. And I think they, a lot of the communities that I worked with would have very much thought about that as restoration projects, but they were, rather than restoring states, they were really interested in restoring social ecological relationships, right? And I think that kind of goes back to your first point there.
Yeah.
One of the big things that they were interested in restoring was changing fish behavior. And they felt like if they fished too often, that the fish would get too flighty. And then, so they had to stop fishing for a while to kind of restore that relationship between the fish and people. I thought was really interesting. You're working on sedentary species, so I don't think the clams are gonna get much closer.
No, they're not running. Although you'd be surprised how fast they dig. But the fish ponds do talk about that as well, and that's the reason why, like, when they bring fish into those fish ponds, they don't overfish them because they don't want the fish to be like, why the hell are we here? We're just going to get eaten.
Yeah.
And so they do have that understanding of fish as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Second one, so you already mentioned Anne Solomon, who's a really close colleague of mine. Do you also know Phil Loring? He wrote a book that I think you'd love called Finding Our Niche. And he was at University of Guelph, and he's now become the lead human dimensions scientist for the Nature Conservancy. And so he'd be a really good partner. He's written a lot about this sort of restoration. And
In Canada or America?
so he's worldwide, like he's the global leader for that. But it may be a great funding source for your three-way thing.
Yes.
So I can put you guys in contact with that because I think that's something that he'd be quite keen on. The question I had though was that because these are all kind of mollusks, how vulnerable are they to ocean acidification? I know they've had to move a lot of operations in Washington State. A lot of the aquaculture operations they've actually had to move because of ocean acidification. And how threatened are these cultural practices by ocean acidification?
So to start with, if the organisms aren't there, then it's really hard.
It's not really threatened, is it? Right? Yeah.
And like if we just go back to how easy it is for ocean acidification to affect these places and the organisms, like oysters, especially here, oysters, mussels, pippies, clams, they're all getting, like their shell strength's getting weakened, they become much more elastic, predation's going on the up, and then you start looking at the abnormalities and the morphology of them as well, which then becomes more abnormalities, so worse morphology. Then the amount of them going from, let's say, umbonant into juveniles is then less, and then also the amount of what was the other thing? Mortality is obviously higher.
Mortality is higher, yeah.
There's something else, but and the pH in the blood, or the hemolymph, whatever they want to call it, it then goes up, and so all of those things start making it really hard for more. And so my PhD work looked on how they're going to be affected by CO2 and temperature in the long run, and that was mostly on oysters on Pacific and Sydney rocks, and we really saw the fact that, like, everyone thought that the parents were giving them more energy, but they're not. They're just giving them better DNA to better associate with that energy, and so it's still seen as a stress, not as stressful, but it's still seen as a stress. And so what we're wanting to understand is, if we start bringing in these practices around the cultural practices, like they've done with the clam gardens in Washington and in Alaska and that, they've seen limitations on the impacts of climate change because of the environmental effect. Right. And so that's what we're hoping to do here and be able to see those same sort of things.
Cool. Thanks, man. John.
I'll be very quick, yeah. Thanks, Mitch, it's great. You mentioned during the talk that people knew there were stories but didn't actually know the stories. Were some of the stories lost due to settler colonialism, etc.? Did you find examples of that, or did you select case studies where the elders were there and the stories have been maintained, or did you find that somehow the stories had to be recovered because of previous colonial practices?
Yeah, it's kind of both. So there's, especially in Cape, they talked about the fact that there's one or two elders that know the stories, but then some of the people that I worked with in the OVK, they were saying that not many people do. And part of their job is bringing that knowledge back to the community. And so when they're talking about hosting different events at the clam gardens, especially that demonstration one, they're bringing those specific elders in to talk about what these clams are, the stories that are associated with them. And so more and more people are starting to understand. So even before OVK started these clam gardens, people just didn't really know much about clams. And then because they brought it back to the community and they've making sure that the community understand what a clam is and what an impact is on the community, they're starting to give more of that information out, and people are starting to understand. They've also got a lot of cousins and brothers and sisters from different places who have those stories, so they come back, they tell people, so they can come back, talk to them about it, say what these stories are, but there's elders that are also still have some of that knowledge. And I wouldn't say colonisation has had as big an impact in that island compared to it as here, say, but there is obviously still that impact as well. And but they were saying that, from what Simon said, he was saying that the reason why it went was because other food sources came in, and people didn't have to know about clams anymore because they had other food that they were eating. They still knew about deer because that was such a big thing that people were a part of. They still knew about salmon because it's such a big thing that happens in the rivers. But clams, you can dig them up or you don't. You don't actually have to see them there. Like, you can know that they're there, but you don't have to eat them if you don't want. Whereas when COVID happened, people had to change that.
Thank you.
Great, well, that brings us just up to time. So I'd like to thank you all for attending, and Mitch for your presentation. So Mitch will be talking again in March at the Ocean Lovers Festival, which I'm sure you've all heard about, alongside some other colleagues from the School of Geosciences. And I hope you can all join us next fortnight, so the 13th of March, where Dr. Rebecca Hamilton will be speaking about her recent research in tropical forest collapse in Southeast Asia. So thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.